just welcoming everyone on behalf of the Grad College and Books and Bagels. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Chris Lanes. He's a professor from LeBeau College of Business. He's also our Director of Strategic Projects and Initiatives in the Grad College.
Troublemaker extraordinaire.
So I will hand it over to Chris.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to Books and Bagels with burgers and vegetarian burgers today. We have two very interesting talks today from two of our PhD students or PhD candidates who are both closing out their time here very shortly. Congratulations. So first up today is Valerie Tutwiler, who will be talking to us about blood clot contractions. So she's from the School of Biomedical Engineering, and we're going to go about 12 to 15 minutes each. If you have questions for our speakers, if it's a clarifying question, go ahead and ask, but if it's a more substantive question, we have to hold them all to the end so we can get to the talks and then enjoy a conversation. All right, thank you.
Hi, everybody. So, how many of you know somebody that has had a heart attack or a stroke? So I'm not surprised that the vast majority of you do, since it's the leading cause of death and disability worldwide. So cardiovascular disease is made up of heart attacks, which are the #1 killer, and strokes, which are the #2 killer. They account for 17.3 million deaths per year. In fact, that is more than all types of cancer combined, and they result in 1 in every 3 U.S. deaths, and 1 American dies every 40 seconds from a heart attack or a stroke. Now, at least some of you are probably sitting there wondering, what do heart attacks and strokes even have in common? So the answer to that is blood clotting. So, as I'm sure that some of you know, blood clotting is a very complex and important process. When you get a cut on your finger, say, you want your blood to clot because you want it to stop bleeding. So when hemostasis, or blood clotting, occurs when and where you want it to, it's a good thing. But when this balance becomes tipped in one direction or the other, bad effects can occur. So on one side, you can get bleeding. So that's when blood clotting doesn't occur and you have far too much bleeding. So this can happen in genetic conditions like hemophilia, but it can also happen in pathological conditions such as a hemorrhagic stroke or when you have bleeding on your brain. On the other side, you can have far too much blood clotting or thrombosis. So this can result in a heart attack or a deep vein thrombosis that can occur in your leg, or an ischemic stroke when you're not getting oxygen to your brain. So my talk is going to focus a little bit more on the thrombosis side. And so I just want to give a little bit of a background on what blood coagulation is going forward. So in a healthy blood vessel, you have a blood vessel that's coated on the inside with endothelial cells. And that protects your blood cells from becoming activated. So the blood itself is made up of a variety of different cells. So you have platelets, which are actually the major component of what causes your blood to clot. They become sticky when activated. You also have red blood cells, and you have different white blood cells, you have secretory proteins, and then you have other blood proteins that are in the blood as well. Now, in a healthy vessel, as I said, they're coated by endothelial cells, which protect anything from becoming activated. But if there's a disruption in this endothelial layer, you get a rush of the blood toward the disruption. And the platelets actually become activated, and this results in the formation of a blood clot. So you have activated platelets that can form aggregates, and then you have what's represented in green here is fibrin. So this is a blood protein, and it's actually a naturally occurring polymer, and it basically acts as the glue that holds the blood clot together, and it traps in red blood cells into the volume of the clot. And as the clot forms, it can then undergo what's called clot contraction, which is the focus of my dissertation research. So you'll see, essentially, it looks like the shrinking in the volume of the clot. And this can occur actually because platelets have contractile proteins in them, just like your muscles have. So when you walk, your muscles can contract, and platelets have the same kind of machinery that can cause them to contract. And because they can interact with the fibrin or that polymer, they can actually pull the volume of the clot together. So here you can just see kind of what an in vitro assay of clot contraction looks like. So again, it's the volume shrinkage of the clot. You start with something where the blood clot makes up the whole volume, and over time it shrinks to a very, small portion of the volume. So why is clot contraction even important? So it's been implicated to play a role in several different clinical settings. So first, in the formation of a good hemostatic seal, or when you get a cut and you have bleeding, it's been implicated in making less blood flow pass through that clot because it's making the clot itself more dense and less permeable. It's also been implicated in playing a role in pulling the wound itself together, and most importantly for the studies that I'm discussing today, in the restoration of blood flow past thrombi. So remember, if you have a heart attack or a stroke and your blood flow is blocked because the thrombi is physically blocking the vessel, if you have contraction and you shrink the volume, you can then get more blood flow. And here you can see the relation between clot contraction and blood flow. If you have a relatively small clot, it's not going to impair the blood flow very much. Whereas in the middle, if you have a 50% reduction in the cross-sectional area of the vessel, you actually get a 76% reduction in the blood flow. But if you have an 80% reduction in the cross-sectional area, or if only 20% of your clot is contracted, you actually get a 96% reduction in blood flow, meaning that your heart or your brain is only getting 4% of the blood flow that it normally would. So collectively, this provides us with the motivation to want to study what is causing clot contraction to occur and how it's occurring. Now, one of the reasons that this hasn't been well studied before was a limit in the methodology to kind of systematically study this process. So the first step in my research was to kind of develop a methodology to look at clot contraction over time. So we came up with a novel application of a clinically available tool, and you can see in the top we add the blood to the cuvette. And then the cuvette is added directly to a water bath, which will kind of mimic the body temperature. And then there is a light source and a camera that can take pictures. And based on the optical properties of the clot, you can look at the change in volume over time. And if I just go here, I can show you the video of clot contraction. So you can see it started at the full volume, and then over time it shrinks in. So that is what our assay looks like to track clot contraction over a period of time. And we can go back to here. And then we're able to get output of data. So we take images every 20 minutes, every 15 seconds for 20 minutes. And we can get nice curves of what is happening over the course of the contraction process. And using nonlinear regression, we're able to quantify different rates of contraction. And then we were also able to determine that clot contraction is occurring in 3 different phases. So the first step was for us to assess how the effect of the blood composition influences the process of clot contraction. So this is important because where a blood clot forms influences the composition of the clot. If it forms in an artery, which has a faster blood flow, you get more platelets, you get more fibrin, and you get less red blood cells. Whereas if it forms in a vein where you have much slower blood flow, so maybe down in your leg, you get more red blood cells that are incorporated. And red blood cells take up a physical volume, so you would expect that they might influence the process of contraction. So we wanted to investigate how each of the cellular and the molecular composition of the blood influences the process. And we were able to determine, as I mentioned, that the process occurs in 3 different phases. And the composition of the blood can differentially affect each of these different phases. And we determined the platelets were critical in the initiation or the first phases of clot contraction. Whereas red blood cells, or particularly their mechanical interference, was important in kind of limiting the later stages of the clot contraction process. So once we saw that clot contraction was influenced by the composition of the blood, we became very interested in knowing if clot contraction would differ between healthy patients and patients with pathological conditions, such as a recent ischemic stroke, or maybe sickle cell disease, or a deep vein thrombosis, those sorts of conditions. Because all of those patients are going to have different composition of their blood than a healthy person would. So we actually went forward and we've been working on studying patients from all of those different populations, but today I'm going to focus on the ischemic stroke population and just very briefly summarize the results that we found. So interestingly, and almost surprisingly, we found that in stroke patients, there was a significant reduction in the extent of clot contraction. So you'll remember if there's less clot contraction, that means that there's a bigger final clot volume. So even though the stroke patients are more hypercoagulable, so there's more kind of clotting occurring, they have less clot contraction that's occurring, but that makes sense, I guess, because there's a bigger clot volume at the end, which means that there's more blood flow that's obstructed. But very interestingly, we separated out the stroke patients based on the severity of the stroke. And surprisingly, we found that in the most severe stroke patients, there was a slight increase in the extent of contraction. And while all stroke patients were still reduced significantly compared to the healthy subjects. So this led us to kind of the proposed mechanism of clot contraction in stroke patients. So we propose that clot contraction is impaired in stroke patients because of the pathological setting. They have an increased red blood cell, they have increased fibrinogen, and they have reduced platelets and platelet dysfunction. So collectively, we propose that this leads to the reduced extent of clot contraction that we're seeing. But when you have a stroke, you get vessel occlusion. And the more vessel occlusion you have, the more damage that you have to the brain. And the more damage there is, you can disrupt the blood-brain barrier. And actually, when you get disruption of the blood-brain barrier, you get a release of something called tissue factor. Tissue factor further activates the platelets and the coagulation process. So we propose that we're seeing a more an increased extent of clot contraction in the more severe stroke patients because of this increase in tissue factor. So it's actually a compensatory mechanism on the part, I guess, of the body to kind of result in a slight better perfusion to that ischemic tissue. So it's an interesting kind of hypothesis, and it was very interesting results. And so this was kind of the first examination of clot contraction in the blood of patients with ischemic stroke. And it's the first indication that clot contraction may have a pathogenic significance in different thrombotic settings. And this shows that clot contraction has the potential to be used as a diagnostic tool or even a therapeutic target, but that this area needs a further exploration. And then I would just like to thank everybody that was involved in any aspect of this study, both here at Drexel, at the University of Pennsylvania, and at the Kazan Federal Research University in Russia.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Our second speaker is Tarimba Obonyo, who is from the LeBeau College of Business doing his PhD in finance, and is here to talk to us about the expertise on the board of directors.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lanes and the Graduate School for Graduate Student Association as well for organizing this. So my research is on expertise on boards, and I focus on the market for directors with acquisition experience. But let me start by setting the stage a little bit by saying, so this is like a basic what you expect from of a corporate structure. You know, you have a firm, and you have owners of the firm who are the shareholders, and then in the corporate structure we have a CEO who's sort of in charge of the day-to-day running of the firm. And when you think of shareholders, I want you to think about you and I, or maybe you and I after we finish graduate school, when you own some shares or something like that. But you and I are the shareholders, and so, but we're busy, you're doing your program and so forth and so on. We don't have time to run the firm, and so what do? We want to get somebody in place who can run the firm on our behalf and deliver value to we shareholders. And usually that's it's not a very easy thing to do because oftentimes for a farm you'll find so many shareholders dispersed all over the country, all over the world, and all over the place, and oftentimes each of them owns a very small fraction of shares. So how do you manage this? Okay. So you and I, who are busy and we don't have much time, we want to get a CEO in place who's going to run the farm on our behalf. And it is imperative for us to kind of put structures in place that make sure that the CEO will actually deliver value to we, the shareholders, and will not pursue other interests that are not in line with what's best for we, the shareholders. So we look at corporate governance structures, the sort of structures that we put in place, and a lot of times that hinges on the board of directors. So we select a team of maybe 8, 9 people or whatever, we call them the board of directors, and we put them in charge of selecting the CEO, firing the CEO, checking periodically to make sure the firm is going in place. And good corporate governance really serves to enhance, to make sure that the capital that we have provided to the firm is deployed in an effective way, and in an effective way means it's generating a return for ourselves, the shareholders. So in corporate governance, we generally focus on the board of directors as the governance mechanism, and the directors whom we often find on boards are executives at other firms, and you probably find the CEO of firm A is the one sitting on as an independent director of firm B. So when he goes to firm B, he's sort of intended to make sure that the CEO of firm A behaves in line with what the shareholders of firm A would want, and so forth. Different firms have different needs, and therefore, if you buy this conjecture, then you should expect different firms to have different boards. So if we think that our structure should look like this, then we'll adopt a structure that makes sense for ourselves. But another firm will probably look for a structure that looks different. What's important for us is to make sure that the people we put in the board have sufficient incentives to work on to represent us. So we have deployed capital, and we want to make sure that this capital is acting on our behalf, and the CEO is not pursuing his own interests. So the incentives that the people of the board tend to have are either direct or reputational. Direct will take the form of you pay them some compensation for going for board meetings. You pay them a retainer fee, and so forth and so on. It could also take the form of we select directors who own shares in the firm, and so their interests are aligned with ours. They could also be reputational. Reputational means you don't want to be the person on the board of a firm that's not doing well, because your reputational stock in the direct labor market is going to tank if you're caught up in that kind of a situation. Previous literature shows that the direct incentives that members of the board of directors tend to have is not as big. Part of it is if you want somebody who owns a substantial chunk of, say, an Apple or Google or a firm out there, then that probably needs to be a really wealthy person to own a lot of shares. So the ownership is not as big. And the direct compensation, you're saying this is not the person's day job. This is probably 100 hours of work a year, and so how much you can pay him to incentivize it becomes a difficult thing to set. So a lot of incentives that these directors then have comes from their reputational standing. And in the market for directors with acquisition experience, this is interesting because there appears to be very limited reputational penalties for people who have engaged in bad acquisitions. So you're a director or a CEO of a firm, the firm decides to buy a second firm, the market doesn't like this, the shares go down, you are sort of in a part of a team that's been involved in something that's not good, and so your reputation in the market should tank. So we don't see that in the market for directors with acquisition experience. Contrast that with people who are on the boards of firms that experience financial distress or reduced dividends. So you're sitting on the board of a firm, it's not doing that great, then your reputation really suffers, and we see that we observe that in the data. Or if a firm is facing litigation because of fraud, you're on the board of the firm, then your reputation in the labor market deteriorates. Or if you're stating financial statements and so forth. But it doesn't seem to happen in the market for directors with acquisition experience. So that's sort of why this becomes interesting. Let me give you an example here. So here I have an anecdote. This is one of the data points in my sample, and we have a timeline. And let's see how this goes. So we have two firms here, Covered Communications and Hewlett Packard. And I'm going to focus on this gentleman called Robert Norling. So Robert Norling was the CEO of Covered Communications, and he was tapped to serve on the board of Hewlett Packard. So if you think of yourself as a shareholder of Hewlett, you own shares in Hewlett Packard, you're saying this is somebody who's supposed to represent your interest and make sure that the CEO of Hewlett Packard is acting in your interest, right? So let's see, Cali Fiorina becomes the CEO. Cali Fiorina, who's taken on a different career path more recently. It's nothing personal, it's just an example in my data set. So on March 9, 2000, Rob Norling is the CEO of a firm. This firm tries to buy or purchases another firm. The market doesn't like it. The Covered Communication stock tanks. A few months down the road, he tries to buy another firm. June 16th, it's even worse. The stock tanks 27%. So, essentially you've lost 27% of your money if you own Covered Communications on that day. But let's see what's happening down here. Norling joins the HP board. So in some sense you're saying, well, this guy's reputation shouldn't be that great because look at what he's doing in his day job. But then at the same time you're saying, oh, look, this is the guy who's supposed to watch over our own interests as shareholders of Hewlett Packard. And the story goes from bad to worse for Covered Communications. The stock is tanking, bad quarter results. Eventually the guy is fired. But if you look at what's happening for him as a director in Hewlett Packard, his stock is actually increasing. He's further down the road re-elected to the board of directors. So it's not exactly a comforting story if you are a shareholder of Hewlett Packard, because you're saying, well, this is the guy who's supposed to watch over my back, but kind of look at how he goes about business in his day job, right? So if I try to situate this in the literature, we're saying CEOs of well-performing firms are sought after to serve as directors. If that's the case, then it doesn't look like Rob Norling is a gentleman who would be sought after to serve as a director, given his performance. By the time he was being fired, the stock was down 84% for the year. Acquisition experience is associated with more opportunities for future board seats. Well, he's been involved in acquisitions in here. The acquisitions weren't great. But what we see in the literature is whether it creates value or not is not considered important. And directors with a reputation as poor monitors might be favored by CEOs. So this is a guy who's not really distinguished himself well as a custodian of shareholder interest in his day job. But if you look down here, he might be actually a good candidate for a CEO who wants to be powerful, because you're saying, well, if I'm the CEO, the person who's supposed to watch over my actions is not that diligent. So that can increase your power. And if you look at some quotes down here about this gentleman called Rob Norling, who was an independent director of the firm, he swear filter to Fiorina, saying, "I didn't join HP, I joined Crowley. If she left tomorrow, I'd resign tomorrow." So, it kind of begs the question: how is this guy really going to watch over your interest as a shareholder of Hewlett Packard? And further down the road, so he's employing his experience doing acquisitions in Covered Communications as a director in HP. In HP, and if you look at HP's acquisitions down the road, they're not that great either. They're not really comforting, and the merger that ended up more or less defining Cali Fiorina's term at Hewlett Packard with HP with Compaq, which she forced through, and the stock declined over 30% upon announcement. So this looks like somebody who's not a very good custodian of shareholder wealth. You've just lost 30% of your money on the merger, and let's see what he says. He says this transaction means you're going to have a healthier company, more capable of competing in the broader market than you have today, and believes the error would be if they did nothing. And 18 months from now, after a great effort of integration teams, you're going to come out of this a much healthier company, and the merger just got by. So what's really going on? We're saying If you're not doing well in your day job, then why should we trust you to watch over our backs in something else? And so that's one of the questions that I'm trying to answer in this. So 3 questions that I'm trying to get at is, do firms engage in acquisitions of different boards from non-acquiring firms, in the sense that, well, we're probably trying to make sure we have people in place who have the experience, expertise, who have been involved in acquisitions, who know a thing or two about this, and so let's have these people to watch our backs as the firm engages in this. So do firms engage in acquisitions of different boards from those that are not? The answer is yes. I find there's a greater percentage of independent directors with acquisition experience on the boards of firms that are engaging in acquisitions. Why are individuals with bad experience not being penalized in the director labor market? Like Rob Norling, why is he being sought after to serve as a board? And there appears to be a systematic demand for them, for folks with bad acquisition experience. And this market is really being driven by firms with powerful CEOs or CEOs whose personal interests are not exactly well aligned with those of the shareholders of the firm. And that question is, does it really matter? Because you're saying, well, he could have not been doing well in his day job, or a student who didn't do well in the exam doesn't mean that the student didn't learn. So maybe he can bring the experience, and a bad cop can do a pretty good job in taking care of our business. But I don't see that either. My findings suggest that shareholders of an acquiring firm may actually be better off with no experienced directors on the board than with having a Rob Norling on the board. So these are the 3 questions that I really get at, and there appears to be a demand for folks who have not distinguished themselves as good custodians of shareholder wealth.
We now have time for questions for either of our speakers. Does anybody have any questions for either Turnbull or Ballard?
Yeah, a question for the second talk. Thank you for the talk. It's very interesting. I was wondering, so I maybe just as a scientist, I just tend to think, like, is there another interpretation to the data you presented? Is it possible that people like Knowles are sought after because even though they have bad experience per se, because they have a history of engaging in very, very difficult acquisitions? So maybe those acquisitions are not, it's not that they're bad at it, it's that they've sought out extremely challenging. Do you have any thoughts on whether your data addresses that at all?
Yeah, so the question is could it be the case that these people are being sought after because they've been doing challenging acquisitions of things that were more difficult as opposed to things that were bad, right?
That's right.
And the answer is I've used a number of different things that could capture this. So you could think of a difficult acquisition in a number of ways. Are you trying to purchase a small firm? Are you trying to purchase a really big firm? Are you trying to purchase a public firm? Are you trying to purchase a private firm? So the negotiations would be different. The regulatory enforcement that you have, or hurdles that you have to jump over, would be different. And so I control for some of those possibilities. And I find so what I can say, I see in the data is that those who have done big acquisitions or buying public firms, those tend to perform worse. But what is also true is that I do not find a systematic relationship that says these people are being sought after because they've been doing more complicated acquisitions. I find specifically what matters is that they've done bad acquisitions.
So actually, I want to ask a follow-up question on that. So, if I understand correctly, the board of directors are not getting a reputation penalty because the CEO had a bad acquisition, right?
So you're thinking of the CEO and the board as almost both entities would suffer reputational penalties for doing something bad.
Right. Right. So, but you're saying no, the board, as being on the board, you're okay.
Being on the board or the CEO, you're okay in the case of acquisitions.
Okay, but does it make a difference if you were on the board of directors, if you were the person who hired the CEO who made the bad decision?
So, question is, does it make a difference if you're actually the person who was on the board when the CEO was hired?
Right.
And that's an interesting question. So, in the sense of you hired a bad guy or we hired a bad person, does that affect your reputation? That's something I can look at. I don't think I have a direct answer to give you. But what is true is the fact that if you're on the board and the CEO proposes an acquisition that's bad, you have an obligation to the shareholders of the firm, or a fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders of the firm to say, no, this shouldn't go through. Or at best, if it goes through, you can say, well, we've got to fire the CEO, and if you cannot get this, you then should say, I resign because I cannot support this sort of thing. So in some sense, you have a few avenues that you can use to stop something that's not good, but I've not particularly examined when you're responsible for hiring the person.
On the first presentation with the clotting, the very end you mentioned about how the individual body per se, the individual person's organs, or when you said brains, creates a different environment for different people for the clotting mechanism. You say sometimes that accelerates or decelerates.
So that was our proposed hypothesis, that the increase in the extent of clot contraction in more severe strokes was a compensatory mechanism on part of the body to kind of result in better perfusion. But it would need much more testing.
Was that looked at before this study?
No, this was
just someone else over here, and just never over here with it.
So this is kind of the first examination of clot contraction in a pathological setting, particularly an ischemic stroke. So it was never looked at before, and it's definitely something that needs more examination and something that we're working on examining more. So that was just kind of what our proposed kind of hypothesis is as to why there's an increase in extent of contraction in more severe stroke patients. So.
And that could be something that might have been treated under hereditary before, but never really, no.
Well, there's also, looking at clot contraction is not something that clinicians currently look at. Which is why maybe it could provide a potential diagnostic avenue if patients that are going to have a more severe stroke do have an increased extent of clot contraction. But again, so the study was done on about 85 stroke patients, so it would need to be done on a much larger scale at multiple institutions to know if, to kind of see if that's a consistent increase in clot contraction and if it can be used as a predictor or not. But.
Thank you for both talks. They were really interesting. This is a question for Val. Kind of following on that question. This is also might be outside of the scope of the project, but as far as diagnostic tools go to look at degree of clot contraction, would that be like an imaging modality or something?
Yeah, so an imaging modality like the one that we use to study clot contraction is a potential avenue for a diagnostic tool. It could also, because the kinetics of contraction are important, it would probably be better something that measured the rate or the change over a course of time as opposed to at a single time point. So an optical tool would probably be ideal, although you could do something that looks not necessarily at taking a video like we did, but at like the optical density over time, so more like a spectrophotometer space.
So it would be a benchtop testing, not necessarily.
Again, this is definitely beyond the scope of my particular project, but yeah, so something in theory that like clinicians could use along with the other hemostatic assays that they do on a regular basis, if it were ever to be a diagnostic tool for any type of a thrombotic condition.
So is it correct then, so sorry, my mind is somewhat on the second talk, so obviously it came after, but would you be able to essentially diagnose or characterize the blood chemistry or the blood molecule content to the point that you could skip the whole, that whole long test, be able to have a profile of chemistries that correspond to good contraction or not good contraction? Is that maybe future work? Or?
I think that clot contraction is such a complex process, and it's a balance of, platelets increase contraction, red blood cells lessen contraction, that it'd be very hard to have because the person has this many platelets and this many red blood cells and this much of fibrinogen, to have the exact value coming out, because it is a balance. So every person's going to have a little bit different and a different ratio. So I'm not sure if a predictive assay kind of this is how much of these 10 things that the person has, and this is how much contraction they'll have. Also, in healthy patients, there's a very tight range of contraction that we see. So it could just be more so, look at clot contraction and, oh, they have a lot less clot contraction. So, maybe they have some type of, sickle cell disease. But of course, they're already going to know they have sickle cell disease because of other tests, sort of thing. So that's why we're trying to expand our studies to include other patients as well. So like sickle cell disease results in an increase in red blood cell stiffness, for example. But so does diabetes and smoking and those sorts of things. So like it'd be interesting to study clot contraction in smokers versus non-smokers to see if that changes clot contraction. And that could, potentially be an interesting study. And maybe slightly more along the lines of what you're asking of are they predisposed for something even though they don't have a condition that would predispose them for it. But the first step is understanding from a mechanistic standpoint, is there a difference between healthy patients and patients with these conditions, and what can cause that difference? And then, very far down the line, potentially the development of something like a diagnostic tool.
All right. I have a question for both of you. So what's your take-home message from the two studies for you? What's your take-home message, and what's the way forward for both of you?
So the question is, what's the take-home message, or what's the way forward? So from my research, really the big question is we sort of need to rethink who we are getting on boards of directors, and so you kind of need a more complete history of an individual, and just having acquisition experience is a line on the resume, but it might not be a complete line on the resume of the individual. You might want to look a little further, and we need to, as shareholders, we probably need to be more diligent about things. So you're busy and you have other things to do, but it makes sense for you. You've deployed your capital, you've made an investment in a firm, and you've got to think about that. So that would be the big take-home message from this. For me, it's probably to try and publish the paper.
So I guess for my studies, the biggest take-home message is that clot contraction is a relatively understudied area of the coagulation process, and that it has the potential significance to be involved as a pathogenic factor in thrombosis, and that would require further study.
I think that's an excellent question to talk on today. So thank you very much. Don't run away. You want to do this?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, so the Books and Bagels, we just present certificates and mark to our presenters. This is for Turimba.
Thank you.
Yes, beautiful one of cows. And
Thank you.
so want to thank all of you. And next month, we don't have Books and Bagels because of the conference, which I hope all of you are aware of, and some of you may be presenting. We want to encourage all of you to come for that conference and also participate in all the events that we'll have as GSA and then the graduate college. So thank you also, Dr. Lens, for moderating. We appreciate all your help, and thank you. Have a very good weekend.
Thank you.
And we take a picture.